The air in the sterile deposition room crackled with a tension thicker than the binders of evidence stacked on the mahogany table. Julian Croft, his voice a blade of condescending silk, leaned forward to pin the woman across from him with a look of theatrical pity. "Let's not
Let's
waste
not
any
waste
more
any more
time,"
time.
he said. "You're a consultant, a hired gun with limited access. You know nothing about the core architecture of the Ethelgard project." He watched as a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the woman's lips as she slid a worn leather-bound journal across the table. "You're right," she said softly. "I only know what I drew on page 1.
This is TS Simple Serene Stories. Before we get back to this touching story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that humanity and miracles are eternal, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get back to the story.
Julian Croft tasted victory the way other men tasted vintage wine, with a connoisseur's palate for its notes of fear, capitulation, and the sweet, lingering finish of his opponent's ruin. He stood before the panoramic window of his corner office, the city sprawling below like a circuit board he had mastered. On his desk lay the final settlement from a brutal copyright case, its terms so punishing that the rival firm would be lucky to keep its lights on through winter. It was a masterpiece of legal evisceration. His flaw wasn't incompetence. He was, without question, brilliant. It was the blinding hubris that followed such victories, a corrosive certainty that the world was a simple machine of predators and prey, and he was unequivocally a predator. His next hunt was already in his sights. The file, delivered by a junior associate with the reverence of a holy text, was labeled Omnicorp versus Ethelgard Innovations. The Omnicorp legal team had presented their case with the polished, righteous indignation only billion-dollar corporations could muster. "They're parasites, Julian!" Omnicorp's general counsel had seethed, his jowls quivering. "Ethelgard is a classic patent troll hiding in plain sight. They steal the breadcrumbs from our R&D table and call it a feast. They laid out a compelling narrative, complete with timelines and technical charts that showed Ethelgard's core product, the Genesis algorithm, appearing on the market a mere 6 months after an Omnicorp internal project was shelved. It was a story Julian had heard a dozen times, and one he was predisposed to believe. It confirmed his most fundamental conviction. Small players didn't innovate. They imitated. They were scrappy and sentimentalized by the public, but in the sterile reality of the boardroom, they were simply thieves with better PR. Julian's arrogance wasn't just a personality trait. It was the key that allowed Omnicorp to lock him inside their carefully constructed cage of lies. He saw the case not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a nail to be hammered. And he was the finest hammer money could buy. 200 miles away, in a repurposed warehouse that smelled of solder and coffee, the nail was refusing to bend. Alara Vance, known to the 50-odd employees of Ethelgard Innovations as their principal technical advisor, saw the world not as a circuit board to be conquered, but as a garden to be cultivated. She moved through the open-plan workshop with a quiet, unobtrusive grace, her presence a calming force amid the low hum of servers and the frantic clatter of keyboards. Today, she stood over the shoulder of a young engineer, her finger tracing a line of code on his screen. "You're trying to force it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The data doesn't want to move that way. Let it breathe. Look for the path of least resistance." The engineer stared, then his eyes widened in revelation. It was always like this. Alara didn't give answers. She revealed pathways. Her official title was a fiction, a shield. Her real role was that of a ghost, the secret foundational mind of the entire company. Her genius was licensed to Ethelgard through an anonymous shell company, a complex legal architecture designed for one purpose: to keep her name off any public document. Years ago, a partner named Marcus had stolen her work, her company, and her voice, binding her with a vicious non-disparagement clause in a settlement that had left her financially secure but emotionally shattered. The trauma of that public betrayal had forged her into a creature of the shadows. Her secrecy wasn't a preference, it was a survival mechanism. Only one person at Ethelgard knew the full story: Ben Carter, the CEO. A former patent attorney himself, Ben had left a lucrative practice in disgust after witnessing a corporate giant crush an independent inventor, a case that mirrored Alara's own. He saw protecting her as a form of penance, a way to rebalance the karmic scales of his old life. He was her buffer, her translator, the one who faced the world so she wouldn't have to. "He's here," Ben said, appearing at her side. His expression was tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Julian Croft." Alara's shoulders tensed. "What do we know?" "We know he's a shark who thinks he's swimming in a goldfish bowl," Ben said. "Just remember the plan. You are a consultant. You are here to advise. You do not need to justify, and you do not need to fight. Just breathe." She nodded, her hand instinctively going to the worn leather journal she always carried, its pages filled with the trade secrets that were the true source of Ethelgard's magic. The inciting incident, when it came, was almost laughably mundane. Julian Croft swept into their largest conference room, his legal team a phalanx of dark suits behind him. He radiated an aura of expensive, predatory stillness. Ben began the introductions, but Julian's eyes scanned the room, assessing and dismissing. When Ben gestured to Alara, "And this is our principal technical advisor," Julian's gaze flickered over her for less than a second. He saw a plain woman in a simple gray sweater. He saw no threat. "All right," Julian said, cutting the pleasantry short and turning to the two male lead engineers beside her. "Let's talk about the Genesis algorithm. Walk me through its core iteration loop. I want to know where the initial kernel came from." He never once looked at Alara. The questions, sharp and invasive, were directed entirely at the men, a clear, unspoken dismissal of her role. The engineers, well coached by Ben, answered calmly. But Alara felt the familiar cold grip of her past, the feeling of being erased, of being silenced. She shrank into herself, her silence a reflex born of old wounds. And Julian, the master predator, made the rookie mistake of a lifetime. He saw her silence not as a sign of trauma, but as proof of her irrelevance. He had his narrative, and she fit into it perfectly. A low-level employee, a piece of office furniture. The fatal underestimation had been made, and the clash of worlds had begun. Julian Croft was a man who hated loose ends, and the Ethelgard case was fraying in his hands. Weeks of depositions had yielded nothing but a unified front of maddeningly loyal employees. His perfect narrative, the one Omnicorp had so carefully crafted for him, had a gaping hole right in the center. The source of the Genesis algorithm remained a ghost in the machine. The core IP was licensed from a third-party shell company, a legal dead end that his team had been unable to crack. Frustration, a foreign and unwelcome emotion, began to curdle his confidence. He needed to reassert control, to break their morale. In a final, desperate gambit born of pure arrogance, he decided to make an example of the weak link. He would expose the quiet consultant, the woman in the gray sweater, as the fraud he believed her to be. He would humiliate her in a deposition, prove she knew nothing, and watch the company's credibility crumble around her. The subpoena was sent. Her name was Alara Vance. The narrative snapped back to the present, to the sterile deposition room where it had all begun. The air was thick with unspoken animosity. Ben Carter sat beside Alara, his jaw so tight a muscle jumped along his cheek. Julian, feeling the familiar surge of power that came before a kill, leaned forward and arranged his features into a mask of theatrical pity. He began slowly, his questions designed to patronize and disorient. He asked about her credentials, her background, her limited access to Ethelgard's servers. all information he already had, but the performance was the point. He was drawing a circle around her, defining her as small and insignificant. Then he went in for the final blow. "Let's not waste any more time," he said, his voice dripping with condescending silk. "You're a consultant, a hired gun with limited access." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a sentence. "You're a technician, a cog in the machine. You know nothing about the core architecture of the Ethelgard project." And then it happened. The trigger, the specific cadence of his words, the dismissive wave of his hand. It wasn't just his arrogance, it was Marcus's. It was the exact echo of the man who had stolen her life, standing in their old office telling her, "You're just the dreamer, Alara. You know nothing about how a real business is run." Something inside her, a part that had been frozen in fear for 5 long years, finally snapped. The terror that had kept her in the shadows was burned away by a sudden clarifying fire. This wasn't about the lawsuit anymore. It wasn't about Omnicorp or Ethelgard. It was about the ghost of Marcus, sitting in Julian Croft's chair, trying to silence her again. This time, she would not be silenced. The faintest, most dangerous smile touched her lips. Her movements were calm, deliberate, an act of cold, controlled fury. She slid her worn leather journal across the polished mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of Julian. "You're right," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying the weight of iron. "I only know what I drew on page 1. Annoyed, Julian flipped it open. On the first page, dated 5 years prior, was a hand-drawn diagram of impossible elegance and complexity. It was the foundational structure of the Genesis algorithm, the very thing his team of experts had been unable to fully comprehend, let alone replicate. Before he could process it, she slid a second document across the table, the license agreement between Ethelgard Innovations and a shell company named EV Solutions. Finally, she looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time, Julian saw not a mouse, but a dragon. "My work is my own," she said, each word a perfectly placed stone. "It always has been." The pieces began to click into place with sickening clarity. The shell company, the third-party licensor, the source schematics, the journal. Julian stared at the evidence, his mind reeling. He didn't have the full picture yet. He couldn't comprehend the trauma or the history. But he understood one devastating fact. His entire case, the foundation upon which he had built his strategy and staked his reputation, had just been demolished by the one person in the room he had never even seen. Julian left the deposition in a state of controlled fury. The world had tilted on its axis, but his first instinct was not introspection. It was rage. He felt the sting of a master chess player who had just been checkmated by a pawn. Back in the sterile quiet of his temporary office, he paced like a caged wolf, his mind replaying Alara Vance's quiet, devastating performance. He wasn't wrong, he told himself. He had been played. Ethelgard had hidden their most valuable asset in plain sight, a brilliant piece of legal misdirection. His anger was a shield, protecting him from the more terrifying possibility that his entire case, his entire judgment, had been fundamentally flawed from the start. But doubt, once planted, is a tenacious weed. As night fell over the city, the anger began to cool, leaving behind a cold, unsettling residue. The image of Alara's face, her calm authority, the undeniable truth in her journal, it gnawed at him. Why go to such lengths? Why the shell company, the secrecy? The official narrative from Omnicorp no longer fit the facts. Driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand, Julian returned to the mountain of discovery documents. This time, he searched not for evidence to support his case, but for the piece that would explain his defeat. He worked through the night, fueled by black coffee and a growing sense of dread. He set aside his biases, his assumptions, his arrogance, and for the first time, simply read. And then he found it, buried deep within a data dump of thousands of irrelevant engineering emails. Deliberately mislabeled was a short 2-line message from a senior Omnicorp engineer sent over a year ago. It read, "This new prototype is based heavily on the Vance concept from the University Symposium. We may have an exposure problem down the line." The name, Vance, hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't just a lie of omission. It was a calculated, premeditated fraud. They knew. Omnicorp knew Alara Vance was the source, and they had built this entire multi-million-dollar lawsuit on a foundation of that knowledge, counting on the legal system's complexity and his own hubris to bury the truth. The anger vanished, replaced by a wave of horror so profound it left him breathless. The shame was a cold physical weight in his chest. He wasn't a predator. He wasn't even a player in the game. He was the weapon, a finely crafted tool of deception, aimed and fired by his own client. The victories he had prided himself on, the career he had built, it was all stained by this single sickening realization. The next morning, Julian walked into the senior partners meeting a changed man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a rigid, almost brittle composure. He laid out the evidence on the polished boardroom table, the deposition transcript, the license agreement, the damning email. The partners, men whose portraits hung in the lobby like Roman emperors, did not gasp in horror. They did not speak of justice. Their response was far more insidious. "This is a delicate situation, Julian," the managing partner said, steepling his fingers. "Our fiduciary duty is to our client. They committed fraud," Julian stated flatly. "They will claim it was a miscommunication, an oversight by a single overzealous engineer," another partner countered smoothly. "It becomes a messy he said, she said. What's important now is damage control. We need to handle this quietly. Consider all our options before we do anything rash." They were giving him an out. They were telling him, in the coded language of corporate law, to bury it, to protect the firm, protect the client, and save his own career. And in that moment of institutional cowardice, Julian's transformation was complete. He finally understood that the law he had wielded as a weapon was meant to be a shield, and he had been pointing it at the wrong person all along. His climax was not a fiery courtroom speech. It was a quiet act of professional suicide. That afternoon, Julian Croft filed 2 documents. The first was a motion to immediately withdraw as counsel for Omnicorp, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. The second was a sealed brief, delivered directly to the judge's chambers, detailing the evidence of Omnicorp's deliberate malicious fraud. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. He was fired before he even made it back to his office, his access codes already disabled. The State Bar, alerted by the judge, launched a formal investigation, and his license to practice law was immediately suspended. The news hit the financial press within hours, and by the end of the day, the Securities and Exchange Commission had announced a federal investigation into Omnicorp for securities fraud, their stock price plummeting in after-hours trading. Julian Croft, the master of the universe, had lost everything. Walking out of the gleaming skyscraper for the penance for a man who had never truly listened to anyone. He was in the middle of interviewing a tired-looking woman fighting a wage dispute when the clinic's receptionist poked her head in. "Julian, someone's here to see you." He looked up, and there she was. Alara Vance stood in the doorway, her presence an impossible splash of color in his monochrome world. She was different now. The quiet, almost fearful energy was gone, replaced by a calm, steady confidence that seemed to radiate from her. She was no longer hiding. She didn't offer pity or platitudes. After a moment of quiet observation, she got straight to the point. "I started the foundation," she said, her voice even. "The one for independent inventors." Julian simply nodded, unsure what to say. "I read about it, congratulations." "Thank you," she replied. "We have our first real case. A young woman, a biomedical engineer. She developed a revolutionary new material for prosthetics. Her university is trying to claim full ownership of the patent, using a clause in her student agreement that's predatory, to say the least. They're trying to erase her, just like Marcus tried to erase me. She didn't offer him a job. She didn't offer him charity. She presented him with a problem, a complex knot of ethics and law, and waited. It was a test." Julian looked down at his hands, then back up at her. The man who once had an answer for everything, who spoke in declarations and finalities, was gone. In his place was someone quieter, more thoughtful. He saw the parallel, the echo of her own story in this new one. He understood what she was asking and what she was offering. Not a handout, but a chance to apply his broken skills to something that mattered. He reached for the one tool he was still allowed to use, a simple yellow legal pad and a pen. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "From the beginning, the story ends there. Not with a resolution, but with a resonant, hopeful beginning." Julian Croft, the man who had lost his voice, sits in a small, cluttered office, finally learning to listen. And as he begins to write, his hands steady, he starts the slow, arduous process of building something new from the wreckage of his life, one carefully chosen word at a time. His redemption was not complete. It had only just begun.
Thank you for taking a quiet moment with us. Every story is a journey, and we're so glad you joined us for this one.
We believe stories are a way to connect, even when we're apart. If you felt a connection to this tale, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our growing circle.
Our question for you today is, what's a simple moment of peace you've experienced this week?
Share it in the comments. Let's fill this space with serene moments.
Until the next story, be well.